Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and let me begin by reiterating a couple of the notes that have already been struck. One of them is that we could get more security for less by spending less money. A second is that much of the huge spending on defense that is going around the world, it's already been described, has been not only failed to generate security, but much of it has been counterproductive. And the third that Dr. Polk emphasized was that we've been addressing 21st century threats with not only 20th century tools, but also with a 20th century mindset. So if we're going to think about these issues, we want to begin by an analysis of the threats to our security, thinking about the best ways of addressing those threats. As an economist, we always begin by recognizing that our resources are limited, and that we have to do the best we can within those limited resources. And that's why the title of this conference, Affordable, is so appropriate. Once we start thinking about that, of course, we start thinking about cost-effective expenditures on security. But if it's going to be cost-effective, we have to spend some energy to identify what are the real sources of the threats to our security and what are the real costs associated with what we're doing. So before getting into a deeper analysis of the economic costs, I want to make three preliminary remarks. The first is that when we think about what we can afford, that depends on how well off our economy is. And that, obviously, in the current context, the big issue is how well are we doing? And it's very clear that we've not been doing very well. And to put it more bluntly, we've been wasting huge amounts of resources in the trillions of dollars, comparable to what we wasted in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the way economists think about this kind of waste is that our resources are not being fully utilized, our human resources, our capital resources. And one can calculate the loss to our economy of this underutilization of our resources in the trillions of dollars. And that's why what's so particularly disturbing is that some of the discussions on the economic agenda are likely to make things worse. The focus on austerity, the focus on cutbacks are in a world, in an economy in which the problem is a lack of effective demand, will actually make the recovery more difficult. We have to remember that the economic downturn was not caused by our deficits, but our deficits were caused by our economic downturn. And the single most important thing to address our deficits, about half of which are due just to the downturn itself, the single most important thing is putting America back to work. The second most important thing is making sure our financial system works better, works like it should, and that doesn't make the kind of mistakes that it made in the years before the crisis. So that's the first preliminary remark, but it's really important because when we ask about what we can afford, it depends on how well our economy is doing. Of course, a lot of the issues of security that we're talking about are not just short run, but long run. And if we address our current problems of the deficit by cutbacks on investments in people and infrastructure and technology, then our economy in the future will be weaker and we'll be able to afford less going forward. So we have to think very carefully as we think about how to respond to the nation's economic problems about not only what we can do to stimulate the economy today, but also what we can do to enhance economic growth in the future. And so that's the second general point. We have to be focusing on maintaining our economic strength. There's a big fallacy that Linda Bilmes and I talk about in our book, that many people think that going to war strengthens an economy. They think about World War II as the way of that we got out of the Great Depression. But that's a false analysis. If the government had spent the resources that we had spent on World War II on investments that increased the productivity of our economy would have been even stronger. So that today, those resources that are misinvested, the way I sometimes put it, the weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist, those kinds of spending doesn't increase our security and doesn't strengthen our economy. The final point I want to raise, preliminary, is when we say affordable, we have to ask affordable to whom? And one of the issues that has to be addressed is the growing inequality in our society that makes it increasingly difficult for those in the bottom and the middle to afford anything. Some numbers that Americans really haven't come to grasp is that the median real income of a full-time male worker, median means half of them above, half of them below, has stagnated for well more than 40 years. The median income of a full-time male worker today is lower than it was in 1968. So if you want to understand why there's a lot of stress and strain in our economy, a sense of economic insecurity, it comes from just looking at what this data says about where our economy is going. So we have an economic system that now not only isn't performing at the aggregate level, but it's an economic system that for decades has not been performing for most Americans. The final aspect, when we say affordable, we need to think about most of the issues that we're going to be talking about are global issues. And that means we need global cooperation. But if we are going to cooperate, get that cooperation, we have to think about better ways of structuring our systems of global governance, including global security and global economic governance. And a major challenge to that is adjusting to the changes in the global economy. The changes in the world have happened very rapidly. In the economic sphere, it happened particularly rapidly in the last decade. And the rise of the emerging markets is a reality that we have to come to deal with. And we're seeing a little bit of that strain in just one recent event, the nomination, how we choose the head of the World Bank. There's a global consensus outside the United States that it's time for these global institutions to be, the heads to be chosen on the basis of merit. And on the basis of merit, one would have thought that somebody who grew up in a developing country would know more about development than somebody who accidentally studied it. And that there would be a stronger presumption that the head of the World Bank would come from an emerging market or developing country. Hasn't happened yet. And the real question is, will it happen now? That will be a test, in a way, of our commitment to reforming global governance. But let me now turn to the real issues before us, which are the threats to our security and the economic response, the cost. Let me, as I say, I'm going to focus most of my time on the economics, but before doing that, I want to emphasize that our threats to our security are very different from the threats that existed in earlier periods. The threats to our security are not any longer state actors. They're not countries that are likely to invade us. We don't have to worry about that. And that's why it's very curious that the United States is spending an amount close to the total spent by the entire rest of the world. It's very hard to say, what is the threat to which that spending is a response. I'm very pleased that later on in the program that we're going to have a discussion of the environmental issues, including global warming, because in one way, these environmental changes, including global warming, represent one of the most important threats to our, not only to our security, I would put even further, to the survival of our planet. But in terms of narrowly focusing on shorter runs issues of security, global warming will set into motion large-scale migration, increased scarcity of water, increased scarcity of land. And so these underlying disturbances almost inevitably will get reflected in cross-border disputes, into problems of security. And it will be very difficult for the United States to remove itself from the full consequences of global warming. And so I think when we think about responding to the threats that we face, threats to our security that we face in the future, we have to understand that policies that we are taking that are not addressing these global environmental factors are weakening our security. They are increasing the threats to our security around the world. The second point when we think about threats to our security and the fact that it's not a state actors is that securing small patches of the Earth's surface does not get us security. So even if we succeeded in making sure that Al-Qaeda was not in Iraq, that doesn't really remove the threat of Al-Qaeda. It could move to another country. These are very, very more portable threats. And the way we've been approaching it, though, has been looking at little patches of territory. We've looked at try to get security in Afghanistan or Iraq. And what we found is that as we focus on those, it pops up in other places like Pakistan or Yemen. So it's very clear this kind of territorial approach to security that may have worked in the past when the threats to our security were state actors is really not appropriate for the 21st century. Well, as an economist, I was asked to come and talk about the economics, the cost of conflict, and I guess I finally come around to doing that. The wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq have shown how expensive little wars can be. The work that Linda Bilmes and I did on the $3 trillion war, the true cost of the Iraq conflict, highlighted those numbers. The true story, the true numbers, the title should have been the $4 or $5 trillion war, but $3 trillion sounded like it was a high enough number, and we wanted to maintain credibility. But the numbers that have come in since we wrote the book have shown that we were, as we said we were, extraordinarily conservative in our estimates. And so what that shows is that even these, a conflict with countries that have a population of 10% of the United States, a GDP of 1% of the United States, can be extraordinarily expensive. These wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, were different from World War II. We were attacked in World War II. We had no choice, but these wars were wars of choice. You can think of them as a project to enhance our security. And whenever you take a project, you ought to look at the benefits, the likelihood of success, and you ought to look at the costs. And while there might be disagreements about this, the benefits, and clearly the judgments that were made by our government officials were flawed, what we can do is a much better job on the cost. And it was very clear that the numbers that were given on the cost, on the economic cost at the beginning of the war, were vastly out of line with what we eventually spent. I don't know if you remember the kinds of numbers that those in the Bush administration came forward with. Numbers like $60 billion. One administration official said it might cost $120 billion, and he was fired because the number was thought to be outlandish and diminish the commitment to war. It's hard to know whether this was the natural optimism of somebody undertaking any project, any venture, or deception. I have to believe that there's a significant element of deception in these numbers. You aren't off by the magnitude, saying 60 billion, winding up with a war that cost $3 to $5 trillion. That's hard to say that was just a arithmetic error. Obviously, had we known it was going to cost $3 to $5 trillion, maybe our attitudes, enthusiasm for undertaking this venture would have been very different. Well, I'm going to be spending a few minutes talking about the economic cost and how we ought to be thinking about the economic cost. I want to make clear that the conventional budgetary economic costs are only a small fraction of the total costs borne by our society. They're the cost in terms of people, not only the people whose lives have been killed, people whose lives have been people who will come back disabled in one way, partially or totally disabled, the kinds of stress that are manifest in the statistics on divorce, statistics on suicide. It's very, very clear that the war has had a devastating effect on the people who've served our country. Again, a lot of people haven't realized the large fraction, almost 50% of those coming back from serving in Iraq and Afghanistan are coming back disabled in one way or another. That is just symptomatic. Those are the kinds of disability for which they can get compensation, symptomatic of the stress and the strain that this war has had. There's also another kind of cost that I'm not very hard to quantify, but I think very important. America's influence is partly because of our economic power, which has obviously been diminished, I think, because of the war, but also because of what's sometimes called our soft power, our moral influence. But what we've seen in the conduct of the war have been behaviors, torture, other kinds of behavior that clearly have undermined our soft power. And there's always discussions about how these are unusual, they don't reflect the best of our country, but the fact of the matter is that they are part of every war. They are a predictable, and were predicted, consequence of this war. That when you put people through the kinds of strain that we put them through, doing things that people are not made to do, to kill other people and put under the kinds of stresses that they are put, it is almost inevitable that you get the kinds of abuses, the kinds of things that have happened in these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even more so when you conduct a war that's very unpopular, and that means that, and one where you rely on a volunteer army, and you don't want to pay for that voluntary army, and rather than paying higher wages, what you do is you lower your standards, and when you lower the standards, there are consequences of that. So when when we think about the cost of the war to the United States and the impact on our security, we also have to think about how the war has undermined one of America's real strengths, our moral authority, our soft power. But now to focus more narrowly on the cost in terms of dollars, there are obviously the straightforward budgetary cost. And when we began our book, working on our book, the kinds of numbers that were bandied around were things like $500 billion. That was a lot of money, but just a fraction of the cost, of the total cost. And as we began our work, we became very convinced that there were all kinds of budgetary costs that were not apparent and that we ought to understand better. Some of it was hidden in the Defense Department. If you look at as we were increasing our spending on Iraq and Afghanistan, we were also increasing our spending in the Defense Department. Over a few years, an amount of about $500 to $600 billion. And it wasn't as if the Cold War had started over again. It was hard to figure out where was all this money going. And clearly a significant fraction of that money was money that was going actually to Iraq and Afghanistan, but not directly so. And there are all kinds of costs that would be reflected. The fact that I mentioned before, it was difficult to get people to go into the Army. It meant we had to spend more money to recruit. And that's just one example of additional costs that are clearly associated with the war that didn't go into, quote, the war budgets of Afghanistan and Iraq. But we also discovered that there were lots of other costs that were hidden in other departments of the government. Insurance policies, for instance, for contractors that were hidden in the Labor Department. One of the just interesting things that as we were rooted around in that area, we discovered one of the really bad actors that was taking large amounts in premiums but almost never paying out, always finding some excuse. In the insurance policy they were writing exclusion clauses like, we don't pay if it's a combat death or a conflict. Well, what do you think you're doing if you're going to sending contractors to Iraq? That's a lot of your deaths are going to be there. Well, guess who the name of that insurance company that was robbing the U.S. government in the years between 2003 and after? Well, it's another company, same company that robbed the U.S. government of $150 billion a little bit later, AIG. So it had been actively involved in, it figured out how to get money from the U.S. government to increase its profits and not really provide what it was supposed to do. But that was just one example of money that was going for Iraq and Afghanistan that was not included in what the U.S. government was telling us the cost of Iraq of those wars. One of the costs excessive costs that are really important and that were not talked about were the costs that would be felt in the future for the healthcare costs, medical costs, and the disability costs of those returning from these wars. I mentioned that close to 50% would be coming back disabled. And obviously that's going to get large medical and large disability payments. This was one area where we had some controversy with the CBO, where they said at the time that we had exaggerated. The numbers that have come out since then have shown again that we were conservative. And the numbers in terms of the present discounted value of these healthcare and disability payments going forward is just short, probably now in excess of $1 trillion. So that's not in our budget. It's not showing up. When we talk about our national debt, we really ought to be including that in our national debt, because these are liabilities that we owe, and it would be outrageous if we didn't honor those liabilities to those who've served their country. One of the problems that we have is that we don't put money aside for those for these medical costs and for the disability payments for those who are serving us. It's a form of, you might call, I don't want to call it deferred compensation, but deferred cost. It doesn't get reflected in our budget. One of the reasons why accounting systems are so important is that if you don't have good accounting systems, you're tempted to do the wrong thing. And that was one of the things that happened in the Iraq and Afghanistan war. So we didn't include the full cost, and that's why, you know, as a matter of public policy in the private sector, we insist on firms looking at the full cost going forward, that they don't use cash accounting, they use accrual accounting. Anybody beyond a corner grocery store has to use accrual accounting. But in the US government, we don't. And in the area of defense, this has very severe consequences. So we go to fight a war, we have future costs of $1 trillion that are not recorded. Well, the decision makers in the Defense Department are focusing on their budget today. So they make decisions like not paying for body armor or not paying for mine-resistant vehicles because it saves today's budget. It costs the individuals who get harmed enormously. It costs the budget enormously in the future, but that's on somebody else's watch. That's 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. So this bad accounting was one of the things that contributed to our under-provision of body armor, our under-provision of mine-resistant vehicles. When Rumsfeld was asked about this, he said something, well, you go to war with the army that you have, but does anyone really believe that the United States didn't have the resources to provide body armor for our soldiers and to do it very quickly? Obviously, we could have done it almost overnight. They were buying these body armor on their own. Some parents who could afford it were doing it on their own. So we could have done it, but it was a matter of budgetary choice, trying to make it seem as if the war was more affordable than it really was. Well, that is one set of problems with the way we've accounted for the war. But there are large numbers of costs that go beyond the budget, beyond the budget of the military, beyond the budget of today and the future. And these are, in our book, we talked about these variety of economic costs. The most obvious one is that the cost when somebody gets killed, the cost that the U.S. government records is the cost of the life insurance policy. There's no cost to the family, no cost to the loss to our economy. The life insurance policy is a small fraction of what their contribution of these young people would have been to our economy. When we discuss the issue of should we have better safety, road safety regulations, better automobile regulations, better environmental regulation, we talk about what the costs are. We talk about issues of we talk about what the issues of what is yeah, when we talk about these various kinds of regulations, what we do is we talk about the cost of those regulations and the benefits, and the benefit of these regulations are the number of lives saved. And when we do that, we value those lives. It's an unpleasant task of trying to value the lives, but if we're going to decide on what should our safety standards be. We have to environmental standards. We have to make those calculations. And the U.S. government and other governments all over the world do this, and the kinds of numbers that they use are numbers is somewhere around $5 million to $10 million, $15 million. But it's not $500,000. That's clear. No one would use a number like that. But yet, when it shows up in our budget, that's the only number that we use. There are a whole other set of opportunity costs. Economists talk about opportunity costs. When we had our National Guard off in Iraq, they weren't available to address the problem of New Orleans when New Orleans had Katrina. And so, had the National Guard been there, perhaps the loss of lives would have been lower, the loss of damage would have been lower. That's a set of opportunity costs. I want to mention one other set of costs that we talked about in our book, which we wrote before the economic crisis, but in many ways anticipated what would happen. We talked about the macroeconomic cost of the war. And the war has a large number of macroeconomic costs. One of the distinctive features of this particular war, set of wars, was that they've been financed totally on the credit card, like a lot of other aspects of American behavior. That when we went to war in 2003, we already had a deficit. Normally, you go to war, you ask people to pay a little bit for fighting the war. And what did we do? We had a tax cut. And so that meant that all the costs of the war were effectively put onto future generation, increasing the debt and the deficit. One of those costs are something that we're feeling today. The worries about the deficit and the debt are leading to discussions of austerity, of cutbacks. And these are cutbacks on investments in infrastructure, technology, education that will put at risk our future economic growth. So that's an example of how a war, particularly if it's not unpopular war that's not financed in an open and transparent way, can lead to future significant macroeconomic cost. But we also argued in the book that the war risked contributing to a crisis. And the reason was the following, that one of the, again, distinctive aspect of the Iraq War, but every war has these kinds of incidental costs, is that it raised the price of oil. Hard to remember, as we're debating about where the cost of oil is that in 2003, when we went to war, the cost of oil was $23 a barrel. And futures market, which looked into the future, looked at supply and demand going forward, anticipated that it would remain around $23 a barrel. But of course, once we went to war, the major anticipated source of energy was the Middle East. We created a lot of havoc in the Middle East, and the price of oil started rising from $23 a barrel on up. Well, why was that important for our macroeconomy? Well, America was spending huge amounts of money, more than $100 billion extra on importing oil. Well, money that was being spent to import oil was money that was not available to generate strength jobs inside the American economy. And that would have meant that the American economy would have been weak. We would have had unemployment. But the Fed responded. It didn't respond in an intelligent way, but it responded by lowering interest rates, stripping away regulation, and creating a bubble. And it worked for a while. So that housing bubble led to a consumption boom. Savings rate in the United States went down to 0 was clearly not sustainable. The result of that was a real risk to the economy that when the bubble would break, the economy would go into a deep economic downturn. And that's exactly what has happened. So the crisis, in some the war, in some fundamental way, is in part responsible for the crisis, for the downturn that we're in, and it's responsible in a second way because the budget constraints resulting from the high deficits and the high debt are forcing us, the public discussion, to austerity, and rather than having what economists call the counter-cyclical policies that would avoid the economy, we're contracting. And people don't realize that while there's a lot of discussion about austerity, we've already begun it. There are 1 million fewer public employees in the United States than there were before the crisis. So rather than government offsetting the weakness in the private sector, government is amplifying the weaknesses in the public sector. Well, all of this one can say in talking about the war in Iraq, wars in Afghanistan, you can say, well, these are bygones. Economists like to say, bygones are bygones. Let's forget about that. We made a mistake. Why is this relevant for today? Well, the last chapter of our book tries to lay out some of the lessons that we should have learned from these crises, from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I've already described a couple of those lessons. Let me just reiterate. One of them is we need to have a comprehensive accounting of the cost of a war. If we're going to ascertain whether it's affordable or not, whether the benefits are in any way commensurate with the cost that we're going to entail, we have to know what those costs are. We won't know it perfectly, but we need to know a lot better than we did when we went to a war and told it was going to cost $60 billion and winds up costing $3 to $5 trillion. So we could have done a much better job. We need a comprehensive accounting that not only looks at the Defense Department, but looks at all aspects of the U.S. budgetary. But we have to look, and when we look at the budget, we have to look at not only today, but in the future, because it is many of the issues that we're talking about are future costs that we're going to have to pay. So it has to be comprehensive across departments, comprehensive over time, but we also have to look at the costs that go beyond the narrow budgetary cost, because those broader costs to our society can be huge, and they were huge in these wars. Some of these costs we won't be able to quantify. They're very difficult to talk about. But at least we should try to enumerate them so that we're aware of the cost to our society of these kinds of approaches to getting more security. From the budgetary point, I think it's important for us to set aside money that we know that we're going to have to bear in the future. We require firms who announce that they're going to have a retirement account to set aside money for the retirees of their employees. We know that we're going to have these budgetary costs for disability, for health care, for our returning servicemen and women. We ought to be setting that money aside. If we did that, we would have a greater sense of what this particular approach to getting security is costing us, and I think that might actually lead us to think differently about how we want to get the security that our country wants and needs. So let me just end by saying that I think this conference, by focusing on these broader issues of security, by recognizing that the kinds of approaches to security that we've had, the war typified by Iraq and Afghanistan, but also by our continuing spending on the Cold War, it's over, in case anybody didn't know, and that kind of spending is not enhancing our security. and that it really is time for, to use the expression, a reset, to really think about what our real security needs are and how we can best use our limited resources to enhance our security. Thank you. We have time, I guess, for a few questions. Is that right? Absolutely. No? Yes. He says yes. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know how you get there unless we get people to think in terms of systems and complexity. And they just don't think that way. We're very linear. We don't consider all of these additional costs. I mean, our educational system fails us that way. Our academic system fails us that way. Our media system fails us that way. And I would say our campaign fine system fails us that way.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think one of the points of a conference such as this is to highlight the kind of boxes that we've gotten ourselves into thinking about. In this particular area, security is really one that I think I just applaud you for organizing this, because talking about national defense has been almost sacrosanct. You know, sort of like the Defense Department wants something. To question that is to question something that is unquestionable. And that has meant that the largest part of the U.S. government spending has been beyond analysis, beyond public scrutiny, and is clearly not doing what it should be doing. And that's why I think this debate about how do we get affordable security is absolutely imperative, and what it is that will actually enhance our security going forward.
I'm David King from the School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford, and your book and your presentation, wonderful in terms of the costings, and a real eye-opener and very important for all governments to take into account, including my own. What about the benefits? You don't mention an analysis either prior to the war or after the war of the benefits, and I'm suggesting there that perhaps the reasons for the war also need to be looked at. What were the potential benefits to those who were in favor? Was this the first of the 21st century resource wars? Was this a war about securing oil? I went into the White House at the behest of my Prime Minister in 2001 to argue the case for action on climate change. And what I was arguing for in terms of action was looking for alternatives to oil that would be available within our economies. I was told in the clearest possible terms that any action in that direction would damage the American economy. And a few years later, we had them embarking on a war that apparently cost $3 to $5 trillion. If I had been given 1/20th of that sum of money, I could have defossilized the American economy. Do you think that is the benefit that was seen, access to secure oil into the future?
Well, let me just say, the reason in our book, we focused mostly on the cost is because we thought that was an area where we could get almost unanimity. You know, that's not a question of controversy. The benefit side is more controversial, and we did have a little bit of discussion. In my remarks, one of the things I emphasized was that one aspect of their model of security was securing a little patch of land. Would that give us security? It would seem to me that was a fundamental flaw in the logic. There were a number of other, I think, fundamental flaws. I think when you go to war, you get a coalition of people with a whole variety of different objectives. But I think the point you're making is, among that, you want to ask, in whose interest is it to go to war? Because we know that it's not in the interest of the kids that are going to be killed. And, you know, most wars don't accomplish what a lot of people think they will. So it is, I think, a reasonable question to ask, to what extent was this an oil-motivated war? You know, one reason that that question naturally arises, Bush talked about getting rid of a dictator. Well, you look around the world, there are a lot of nasty dictators in the world. And if I were going to have a, you know, a dictator eradication program, you know, and I might support that, I would want to make some judgments about who are the worst dictators. You know, and you might say, in a cynical way, cost-benefit. How many people's lives do we save per dollar spent by eradicating one dictator versus another? And I think, you know, Saddam's pretty bad, but I don't think he makes at the very top of the list of the worst dictators. And that leads you to ask the question, was there something else going on? And obviously oil is a particular example. There'll be some discussion later, I think Linda will talk about a little bit about some of the people who actually wound up getting a lot of the money. You know, where did that $3 trillion go? And some of that obviously went into the pockets of some people who did well by the war, and Halliburton's name obviously is one example. So I think it is important when we think about not only the cost side but also the benefit side, and to have a more analytic approach to these issues of what are the alleged benefits, what are the likelihood that we'll get them.